Well, thank you all for coming. I am an associate of the Ian Ramsey Center, as Father Dr. Andrew Pinson has just indicated. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, who's both a colleague and a friend, Dr. Jennifer Thweatt, who holds a PhD in philosophy and theology in the area of religion and science from Princeton Theological Seminary. Her research interests include things like theological anthropology, the philosophy of science and epistemology, biotechnologies and bioethics, posthumanism, transhumanism, as we'll hear a bit more today, feminist, queer, and post-colonial theologies, and has written probably the most important book in this area called Cyborgs, a theological anthropology of the posthuman, which I assume and hope she'll be speaking to from this today. And currently she is a visiting lecturer of humanities at Flagler College in St. Augustine, Florida. So thank you so much.
Well, I've made it to the podium without tripping. So first hurdle, cleared. All right. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. You publish your research and it seems to go out into the great void and then nothing happens. And then it turns out that several years later, there were some people who did in fact read it, and it never fails to give me a thrill. Oh, really? You read it? Are you kidding me? That's marvelous. So I will be speaking to the major argument of the book, Cyborg Selves, today. But I'm hoping to frame it in direct conversation with the lecture from last night and pick up on some of the basic questions that we heard. But before I begin, I just want to say thank you so much for this invitation. And an additional thank you for your kindness and working with me to bring my oldest and best creation with me. That's my daughter Claire over there. All right, so the small abstract in our program starts out by noting that the question posed by potentially transformative technologies is, what sort of creature do we want to become? And then I note that the answer to that question, whatever the answer may turn out to be, is going to always presuppose an answer to a prior question, which is, well, what sort of creature are we now? So the basic utility of post-human discourse, as I see it, is not simply the fun and games of, well, let's speculate about what might be around the corner and what might be awesome about that, what might be terrifying about that, depending on sort of how you're wired on the optimism-pessimism spectrum, personality-wise. But it throws this spotlight on what it is we think we actually are, and what it is about that we value, and what it is about that we are on some level discontent with and want to change. So the question last night, the recurring question of who is the we? All of that, right, that I just stated, the utility of posthuman discourse is that it throws a spotlight on what? Who we think we are. That suspicious and undefined and vague we is littered all over that sentence. And that really is, I think, the most important question to get at on a couple of different levels. So we're going to kind of come back to that question over and over. So as a little bit of backstory on how I even came into this topic. How is it that I am studying theology and religion and science stuff, and then suddenly, yes, of course, a dissertation on cyborgs and God. That's just obvious, right? The way I stumbled into this essentially was through a footnote. In Hart and Negri's enormous tome, Empire, which I was reading for a seminar, there was a throwaway reference in a discussion on post-colonial hybridity, a throwaway reference to cyberpunk fiction. Now, my little nerd heart just jumped out of my chest at that throwaway reference to William Gibson's Neuromancer. And at the end of that very exciting sentence, which they did nothing more with, there was a little number, and I thought, I need to go see what that's all about. So I flipped to the end of the book, find the end note, and it's a half page, right? The most exciting kind of end note ever. Just as a side note, like, let this be your reminder that footnotes and endnotes are often the most exciting parts of published works. Never skip them. It's where the good stuff is. And that was where I stumbled upon my first mention ever of Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. Never heard of it before. But that one note in that one book opened an entire new world to me, and it made sense. I thought, oh, of course, hybridity. In the character of Molly in William Gibson's Neuromancer, in all of its ambiguity, right? Agency, enhancement, and yet, what is she in that novel? She's not fully in control of her own destiny, right? So it's an ambivalent enhancement in that narrative. So that's where it came from. From the very beginning for me then, as I started thinking about that both abstractly and then more concretely as the idea of cyborg hybridity became very personal, in the form of a young man that I still to this day call my favorite cyborg. His name is Ira. He was a not yet born child of my preacher in my church. At the 20-week ultrasound, Ira was diagnosed with congenital diaphragmatic hernia, which essentially means he had no diaphragm, which is a problem for things like breathing. Now, as long as he was in utero, that was fine, but it was going to be a problem as soon as he was out. It was impossible to tell how serious that condition was. It can range from mild to severe. It can be corrected with surgery if it's mild. It can be life-threatening if severe. When he was born, he was hooked up to a machine that my preacher said to me in all seriousness that the surgeon had pointed to and said, "This machine is essentially a person without a head." And I said, "No, he did not say that." That's how he defined it. The ECMO machine, which essentially externalizes all of the basic necessary functions of the body, oxygenates the blood, filters the blood, puts the blood back into you. And this is how he lived. So Ira was my image of cyborg hybridity. The entire time I was doing this research, here was this child, this vulnerable infant, wholly dependent on technology for the functioning of his biological body, right? My favorite image of Ira a couple of years later, after coming home from the hospital, going back in, coming back out, ended up with a tracheostomy and an oxygen machine and a plastic milk crate on wheels that would trail after him as he played tag after church with his sister. And that is my image of Ira to this day. I mean, of course, he's now as old as my own child, so, but as it is with adults, we freeze children in that freeze frame time. So that is my cyborg, a vulnerable infant dependent on technology for his very life, for the air that he breathes. That's a very, very different entry point into this discussion than transhumanism, right? So as I start my research and I start reading other theologians and I start reading their critique of posthuman visions, and often, especially early on, this very resounding rejection of these visions of the posthuman, I thought, I don't know what they're talking about. My posthuman is this baby hooked up to an oxygen machine and a milk crate. what are these people talking about? This is not the same thing. So very, very slowly, I did begin to realize as I sort of mapped the territory that what was happening is that there were multiple conversations going on, and there were multiple we's behind the scenes doing the defining both of the posthuman vision and of the human, the anthropology embedded within it. And that was a slow realization that I got dragged into kicking and screaming. So there we go. So the thesis of the book then became, essentially, there are multiple posthuman conversations going on, and they're not the same thing. These are separate. I put the thesis in very strong terms in the book, even describing these two discourses as all but hermetically sealed off from each other. That may be a little too strong. I may have to do a little repenting and backtracking at this point. It has been, after all, over a decade, and transhumanism has continued to evolve, so it may be that I need to soften that stance a little bit. I welcome some pushback, I guess, is what I'm doing right now. I'm inviting you to critique that. But at the time, these were completely separate, completely different groups of people having different conversations about different visions of what it is we should aspire to become. And then buried in those visions, different ideas of what we already are. So the argument in the book is not just, okay, these are different things going on, but we have to be very, very careful as theologians, as we engage with this, to state specifically, this is the vision of the posthuman and the underlying anthropology that I'm engaging with, this one and not that one. Because the critique is not one size fits all, because there are multiple we's defining these things. All right, so terminology then becomes incredibly confusing. What do we mean by the term posthuman? What is transhumanism? What is critical posthumanism? How do we define the cyborg, and how do all these things fit together? When I use the term posthuman, I always intend to use it as an open-ended, space-holding term. We don't know what that is. It's a blank space that we fill in depending on who the we are. Transhumanism, I will always use to refer to one branch or the other of that definitely not monolithic movement, again, still continuing to evolve. When I talk about the cyborg and critical posthumanism, that is the Donna Haraway feminist disability and animal studies kind of strand of posthuman thought. And I see the cyborg and the transhumanist posthuman discourses as fundamentally in contrast to each other. So I hope to unpack that here in a second. So the question then, what is the human in transhumanism? It can be hard to pin down. Another thing, and I owe credit to Wenzel van Heijsteen for this, is to say the more specific you can be, the better. Don't just talk about transhumanism in a broad, general way, right? But identify, are you talking with Nick Bostrom, or are you talking with Max Moore? Those are very different thinkers, right? So which transhumanism, within the multiple transhumanisms even, are we engaging? I tend to engage with the Nick Bostrom, James Hughes strand of transhumanism. Back when I was beginning my research, the label for this was democratic transhumanism. I believe that Hughes has now transferred over to the term techno-progressivism. Means fundamentally the same thing. There's just been a lot of rebranding happening in the last decade for various and understandable reasons. Bostrom and Hughes and this strand of transhumanism that I tend to engage with situates the movement as a direct inheritor of Enlightenment rational humanism. That is Bostrom's phrase. So the human in transhumanism then is the human in humanism. And what is that? Catherine Hales, whose work I greatly admire and depend on heavily, uses the term liberal humanist subject to sort of tag this construction of the human. But what is valuable about this? What is the human that we want to enhance and preserve in this version of transhumanism? Notions of rationality, of autonomy, of individuality, of self-determination, freedom, free will. These are the things, right, that we inherit from this philosophical tradition that define the sort of very best about humanity. And so it becomes these things that transhumanism, this strand of transhumanism, wants to preserve and amplify and enhance, right? But implicitly within transhumanism, depends on where you want the weight to fall in the term, right? When you situate transhumanism as the direct, logical inheritor of Enlightenment humanism, then what we're talking about is transhumanism, right? With the emphasis on the human in that optimistic sense. But it's also transhumanism. So what is it then about the notion of the human embedded in transhumanism that isn't what we value, right? What is it about the human that transhumanism aims to change, not enhance, but to leave behind? So if you go back to documents like the Transhumanist FAQ, largely authored by Nick Bostrom, although it is a collaborative document. If you go back to those primary sources and actually look at the specific things that transhumanists aim to improve and change about the human condition, it turns out to be the notion of biological limitation, specifically. So what is it then about the human that we want to preserve? Free will, agency, creativity, imagination, intellect. And what is it that we want to change? Suffering, sickness, aging, right? And these are, of course, corollaries of current biological embodiment. I read this as an attempt to leave behind vulnerability and to achieve something like invulnerability. So we preserve agency, we preserve intellect, we preserve freedom, and we leave behind the possibility of being hurt in various ways. So what we value about the human turns out to be a fundamentally disembodied vision of what it is to be human. Where is freedom located? Freedom is mental, right? Freedom is an exercise of mind, intellect, rationality. These things we conceive of in the Western tradition as disembodied. And all of the limitations that we rail against, that we experience as fundamentally negative, these are biological. These are implications of embodiment. So this is, I think, the way to read transhumanism, that it is a search for invulnerability. And invulnerability in this sense implies at least a change of embodiment. Maybe not full disembodiment, right? But at least a shift away from the current biological embodiment. We want to be stronger, we want to be smarter, we want to be, faster. We want to leap tall buildings in a single bound. I don't know what all we want to do, right? But reading the documents, getting smarter is front and center. Cognitive enhancement. Now, right, more recent conversation adds moral enhancement into this. And I think it's right to ask, are these the same thing? Can we take that for granted? And ask the further question, if we have the sense that we are morally compromised beings already, can a morally compromised being have the capacity to envision its own moral perfection? Or is that simply impossible, right, given our flawed constitution? So a separate conversation. I'm not going to chase that rabbit right now. All right. So the last point I want to make about the human and transhumanism is that the referent, and this is always implicit. I have not found a single place where this has been explicitly owned, but the referent is always presumed to be the individual self, the person, the singular person. And this is important because when we switch over and talk about the human in critical posthumanism or the cyborg discourse, that's not the assumption. I found myself trapped into watching a terrible, terrible movie a couple of weeks ago. Never simply surf Netflix looking for a sci-fi movie you haven't seen yet. Because if you haven't seen it yet, it wasn't worth seeing. I think the title was Hyperion. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, well, you're better off. But it was a very straightforward sort of transhumanist narrative. You know, the world is falling apart. We need to figure out, you know, a sort of escape. We need to go live on Mars. This was actually a moon of Mars, right? So we need to go live elsewhere because we've trashed the Earth, so we need to get out. Well, in order to get out and in order to thrive, we're going to have to change our human biology to be something compatible with this new environment, okay? So we're going to, you know, pull out our bag of tricks and tinker with our genetics and see what we can do. So naturally, all of the experiments fail terribly except for this one man left standing at the end of the experiment, the only one who survives and sort of successfully genetically transforms into this now unrecognizable creature who is thereby estranged from his wife and child because they literally can no longer communicate, and ends up being the single creature alive in this alien landscape. And the movie ends there with this alien moonscape and this transformed posthuman creature, solitary and alone, swooping through the sky with heroic music swelling in the background. And I sat on the couch and thought, I think I'm supposed to feel good about this ending, but it's just really sad because what did he gain? What did he gain? And what did he lose? He lost a life. He lost a family. He lost a world. And now he's alone swooping through the air. And all he's got is a heroic musical background that presumably he can't even hear. So I did not see how this was triumphant. And I still don't. It's only triumphant if the individual self is completely self-sufficient. That to me is not what the human is. So transhumanism and I have a fundamental divergence on this, which is why, as I do in the book, I completely take sides and say, we need to go this way and not this way. I don't want to be a single solitary creature swooping through the air in an alien moonscape. I like my kid. I want to keep her around. I want to be around her. I don't want to just take off and somehow be completely self-sufficient. That to me is not a happy ending. That sounds hellish. Which actually reminds me of a C.S. Lewis quote from The Four Loves. Oh, I wish I had it. I wish I had it noted down. Something about vulnerability and invulnerability. I'll have to track that down at some point. So, if that's the human and the transhumanism, that's not what I think it means to be human. And so I have a hard time getting on board even with the most modest transhumanist posthuman visions, because my fundamental feeling is that they are built upon an erroneous notion of what it means to be human to begin with. So if that's not what I think it means to be human, what do I think it means? So we turn to the cyborg discourse and Donna Haraway. What is the human in critical posthumanism? I'm actually going to, we found a lovely quote from Carrie Wolf, actually, that I just want to pick up and read. I didn't feel like writing it down verbatim, so just cheating and looking it up. So as Carrie Wolf comments, transhumanism derives directly from ideals of human perfectibility, rationality, and agency inherited from Renaissance humanism and the Enlightenment. And, he says, it therefore has little in common with Haraway's playful, ironic, ambivalent sensibility in a Cyborg Manifesto, which is suspicious, to put it mildly, of the capacity of reason to steer, much less optimize, what it hath wrought. I guess the King James English there was for emphasis. I don't know. So if transhumanism directly and consciously situates itself as a continuation of Enlightenment humanism, critical posthumanism situates itself very, very clearly as a post-Enlightenment critique of all of that stuff, essentially. It is a critique of the historical and political and social exclusive constructions of the category of human, right? Very conscious of the ways in which that category has been withheld from great swaths of humanity for political and economic reasons, for exploitation, right? It is a critique of autonomy and individuality, of self-sufficiency. It is a critique of rationality with a capital R as a single monolithic exercise. It is a critique of all of that. So critical posthumanism takes a sort of fundamentally opposed stance from the very beginning to all of the things that transhumanism intentionally adopts. All right, so back to my favorite cyborg, right? My sweet little vulnerable infant hybrid with technology. So from the very beginning, right, my entry into posthumanism visions was a vision of material embodied hybridity, of dependence, of integration, in ways that push directly back against a vision of sort of autonomy and self-sufficient individual selves. This is what made it so difficult for me, first encountering theological discussion of the posthuman, which took for granted this transhumanist version of it, because I simply didn't recognize it. The utility for me of specifically cyborg hybridity is not just that it calls for a sort of valuing of embodiment and relationality in abstract terms, in general terms, but that Haraway pushes us very strongly to look at the specificity, not just of the human body, right, but of human embodiments, plural, right? We all know, there is no such thing as the human body, yeah? Unless you're Plato, you don't think that such an ideal form is actually in existence somewhere, right? Instead, what do we have, right? None of us here exist in the human body. We simply have our own human bodies, and they are all fundamentally different in ways that make a difference in how we navigate the world, in how we experience the world, in how the world perceives us, and how we get from place to place. And paying attention to those specificities is the key, I think, here to moving beyond a generic value of something like materiality as a value in itself. Or, and this is part of my critique of Hales as much as I love her, she talks about the value of finitude. But why should finitude as an abstract concept be any inherently more valuable or preferable than infinite? Why? Give me a reason. A reason is lacking there. So I think cyborg hybridity is our way to shortcut those generalities, to say, well, we just think that finitude is better for us than not. Well, that's not sufficient for me. So let's pay attention to specifics. What does this body need to function? What does Ira's body need to function? Well, it depends. Ira's 6-month-old body needed the machine that was a person without a head. It needed the ECMO. Later, he could wean off to just the oxygen. Now, he's not, the tracheostomy's closed up. He no longer carts a milk crate behind him. He probably no longer plays tag with his sister. A little too old and dignified for that these days. But what does his body need to function? His body needs a diaphragm. And he has one, and it's made out of Gore-Tex. And that's amazing, right? I don't need that. I don't have to navigate the world in that way. But that's definitive for his experience. That is his normal, right? So there's no longer a single norm that we aspire to. There is simply, what does human embodiments in the plural tell us about how we navigate the world, how we thrive, how we relate to each other, what you need, what I need, and what we need to supply each other with in order to survive together in this space. So the emphasis here is always in direct opposition to this notion of, well, technology is what frees us from dependence. It frees us from dependence on the earth, right? It frees us from dependence on each other. It frees us from the vulnerabilities attendant to depending on external things for our very lives. Yeah? If that's not the goal, then, if we're not searching for that invulnerability, that separation of ourselves from dependence on things in order to live, then what is the goal? That fundamentally changes the posthuman vision that we quest after. If we're not questing after that separation of ourselves from everything that we depend on, but instead embracing these are the relationships that make us who we are. This technology, this Gore-Tex diaphragm, right, is what makes Ira who Ira is and allows him to live. That is what he needs. And since Gore-Tex does not grow, right, he requires an upgrade every so often because he grows. Yeah. If our vision of the posthuman is one which values the kind of relationality which enables survival for different bodies, then we are no longer talking about invulnerability as a goal. We are instead running in the opposite direction because dependence on other things, other people, means vulnerability as a condition of relationship. And so again, right, the argument in the book is that critical posthumanism and transhumanism are starkly opposed to each other. And then further, that as a theologian, the vision of posthumanism that I want to engage with is one which says relationality is what it means to be human. Not simply because I'm in love with the cyborg and it's cool and all of that, and Donna Haraway is a genius, but because I grew up reading the Bible. And the Bible tells me so. Sorry, I went back to Sunday school for a moment. So when we go back and we read the narrative of creation in Genesis. Both narratives, I should say, right? When we go back and read this, how do we read it? So this is where things get tricky, because as I see it, Christian theology stands as much in need of critique on these matters as transhumanism does. My friend Micah Redding, who incidentally also grew up in the same denomination that I did, which is Churches of Christ, has said quite strongly that the worst mistakes of transhumanism are the same mistakes that Christian theology makes on these questions of what it means to be human. I think he's probably not wrong about that. He's a little more sanguine as head of the Christian Transhumanist Association than I am about the possibilities of transhumanism becoming a fruitful dialogue partner. But we read transhumanism differently, which is always good. So, it's not necessary to read the narrative of the creation of humanity in Genesis as one in which, right, God placed us in our place. We did not stay in our place. We aspired to something else. We broke that relationship out of pride, and then we were punished. And now we need to find our place and stay in it. We can read it that way, and we have. That's how it was always preached to me. But what if instead, and this is where we finally get to cyborgs in the garden. Finally. It's only been 40 minutes, you guys. What if instead we read this narrative not as human beings are created special and unique, apart from the rest of creation, put in charge of creation as God's representatives with, the imago Dei as this special capacity unshared by everything else around us. Instead, what if to be human is to be cyborg? What if we take that seriously? What if, in being cyborg, what this means is that we were never set apart and separate from the rest of creation. We were always intimately dependent. We were always hybrid with it, right? We have always depended on our surroundings, on our environment, on our circumstances to live. That's the garden. So if we are cyborgs in the garden, and to be cyborg is the same thing as to be human, how does that change our theological reading of what it means to be human in that narrative? So this is honestly my favorite image out of everything that I've written. I wanted it desperately to be the title, and they just said no. I was very sad. But I was quite happy at this year's past American Academy of Religion meeting to receive a critique from Scott Midson, whose new book is really wonderful, where he picks up on the importance of this image to me and pushed in a very helpful way to force me to clarify what it means to put cyborgs in the garden with a capital G, because the garden, he said, and I think rightly, the garden is still a garden. That's that sort of natural, organic image that says there's no technology here because we don't need it. Yeah? What do we use technology for? Technology is our problem-solving apparatus. Well, in the garden, right, if we read it in the sort of traditional way, the garden is paradise. There are no problems to solve, therefore, right, we just walk around plucking fruit from trees, except for that one. And and that's all we do. We don't need technology, right? And so this is how he received that image. And I said, oh, but I've never thought of it that way. I actually have always assumed that cyborgs in the garden means that the garden is also technological. I just never actually said it. So it was great to be called out. So was there no technology in the garden? Absolutely there was, right? What are the first primal humans charged to do? Charged to name, charged to tend. These are skills, right? This is techne. And what happens in the narrative if we read it this way is now we've got humans that are intimately dependent on their surroundings and in relationship, not just with each other as equals, but with all of the non-humans populating this environment, including that very suspicious talking snake. And with whom else? With God, who comes and walks and talks with them in the cool of evening. So to be human, to be cyborgs in the garden, is to be in relationship with the surrounding environment, to tend to it with skill, to be in relationship with all of the non-human population of creation around you, to be in relationship with God. So you are in relationship not just human to human, right? But with a variety. I'm going to keep doing that, aren't I? But with a variety of non-human others. And then what happens? Well, we traditionally read the original sin as the sin of wrongfully ordered aspiration, of pride. What if it's not that? What if the problem is not that we wanted to become more like God, right? That actually seems like a kind of aspiration to greater relational intimacy, possibly. Not sure that that's wrong. What if the problem is that in doing so, we violated relationship? What if the problem was not an arbitrary disobedience? What if it was, you don't eat of this tree because this is the kind of tree you don't eat from? I'm speculating here. Happy to speculate. What if the act is a violation of relationship? Not in the concrete materiality of it, right? But what does the tree represent? Knowledge, immortality, according to the snake. What if the problem with reaching for the fruit, for reaching for immortality, is that immortality is invulnerability, and invulnerability makes relationship impossible? So our cyborgs in the garden screw up, but not because they want to know more, but because they reached for something that put them definitively out of the realm of relationship with the human and non-human others around them. That seems to me to be at least a plausibly faithful reading of what's going on in the text. And then what happens to techne as a result? Well, the very next skill set we see employed, sewing. And in order to do what? To cover up the shame of having violated relationship, knowing that they had. So what we see then is technology, right? Even in the garden, present in its ambivalence, right? Skill sets employed rightfully in right relationship, and then the skill sets employed in the aftermath of the violation of that. So, where do we go from here? I feel like I haven't actually answered any concrete questions, which is okay with me. In the book, I very, very carefully stayed largely away from bioethics specific questions. I thought we need anthropology before we move into some of these concrete bioethical conundrums. We need to understand what it is we are before we can talk about what should we and shouldn't we do concretely. But I think the anthropology suggests at least a general starting point for answering some of those questions. of course, our technologies are ambivalent, right? It's not a knock on transhumanism to say that their vision of the human is both one that they celebrate and one that they want to change. That there are things about the human they embrace and things about the human that they despise. Christian theological anthropology is no less double-handed in this way, right? So it's not a critique per se. Our technologies are ambivalent because we are, yeah? So how do we employ them? How do we make the decisions around what are these exciting technologies? How are we going to use CRISPR? What are we going to use it for? How are we going to develop the next step beyond that? And what is that going to do? And how do we decide this is a good way for us to go? This is a bad way for us to go. I think vulnerability here is the key. If we are running away from the condition of vulnerability as the necessary condition for relationality, then we are going the wrong direction. If we are reaching for technologies and techniques that honor the human as inherently relational, as dependent on each other, as dependent on the environment, as dependent on human and non-human others alike, then I think we can say, okay, well, let's talk about what that would look like. How do we design this? How do we employ this? How do we make this accessible? How do we talk about all the practicalities of this? But first, what vision does this conform to is the basic question. Haraway has some interesting work, specifically on the figure of Jesus as a suffering figure. I'm not going to say too much about this because I'd rather hear back from the room and have some healthy Q&A. But she's not unaware that the implication of hybridity and relationality in this way means that there is vulnerability. Openness means, responsiveness means that yes, you can get hurt. You can't foreclose on that possibility. To foreclose on it is to walk away. This is where the C.S. Lewis quote from The Four Loves that I can't quite remember right now comes back into play. Pushing forward beyond the argument in cyborg selves, and in fact, I'm actively working on sort of the initial articulation of some of this for friends here in the room who have already forgiven me for my lateness on this project. I want to think through natality. Pick up Grace Jansen, Elizabeth O'Donnell Gandolfo, and the image of natality and vulnerability and interdependence and what this tells us about what it means to be human in light of these transformative technologies that we think are going to take us into some next realm of becoming. So back to my little abstract in the book. I note that to put the cyborgs in the garden is to push back against various problematic isms of all sorts, right? I want to say this pushes back against an anti-material supernaturalism. Why? Because we're attending to specific embodiments as definitive for what we are. Pushes back against an anti-spiritual materialism. Haraway herself is intentionally sacramental. Even while she's very anti-Catholic, she is intentionally sacramental in the way that she conceives of the material world. It pushes back against a sort of anti-technological naturalism, where nature and technology are somehow pitted against each other as opposites. And it pushes back against a kind of anti-social anthropology. So, To conclude, one of the things that I do with students in the classroom, and I work these days mainly with first-year college students, and they love to talk about cyborgs, which means I get to have a little bit of fun. But they don't know what a cyborg is. It used to be, when you said the word cyborg, everybody's first image was Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? It turns out that nowadays, first-year college students envision a very different cyborg because they grew up watching Teen Titans. So that's shifted the conversation in weird ways for me. But in order to sort of introduce them to this sort of world of thinking around how do we define what it means to be human, I simply make them do it. I write the word human on the board, and I say, you have to tell me what that is. How do you know that you're that and that these other things in this room are that? And we end up every time, right, sort of drawing a box. Human, right here, this is what we're defining. What doesn't fit here? You draw a line. Over here, non-human animals, right? Definitively non-human. Draw the line on the other side. Over here, machines, definitely not human. I always like to add a line on top and write God, right? And then everybody's like, what goes on the bottom? I don't know. That's the realm of the demonic or something. I don't know. And in walking them through that, then, and saying, well, what made you draw this line? What's the difference between you and a chimpanzee, right? Why did you draw this line? What's the difference between you and a machine? Why did we draw this line? What's the difference between you and God? It's helpful because it shows them that those lines are lines that they drew. They put those lines there. And Haraway's takeaway always, regardless of whether you're talking about technology or anything else, is we drew those lines. Those are our lines. And if we notice that we drew them badly, we get to redraw them and think of this a different way. That's where I'll end.
Thank you so much, Jen, and also for some amazing images. I'm going to remember the image of the Hyperion, of the solitary posthuman flying in this alien landscape. It's quite hellish. Yeah? So no, thank you. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk. So let's have some fun Q&A. We've got up to half an hour, I think. So do you want to field questions, or do you want me to just point out?
I'm happy for you to moderate.
Okay, right. Gentleman there. Yes. Oh, could you just wait for a microphone, and Dr. Burdett will be with you shortly. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Jen. So I'm friends with a woman named Rosemary Garland Thompson, and one of the things that she's mostly a secularist in her overall approach, and one of the things she keeps talking about is conserving disability. And what I just heard you say is that you want to conserve vulnerability. And I guess the question I have, well, I have several other questions, but I'll stick to this one about conserving disability or conserving vulnerability. That goes against the grain of virtually everything that medicine and technology has to do. It goes against the very grain of the founding anthropology or mythology of the anthropos that is regnant in contemporary post-industrial cultures. And it kind of hits the ear in a way that kind of grates against it. And it's something that, in educating pre-medical and medical students in the U.S., it just goes against all of the entire diatribe of what it is that they are aiming to do. So, and Rosemarie has a terrible problem with this conserving disability as well, because it just grates against the ear. So what narratives are there for us where we can talk about conserving vulnerability, conserving disability, that then promotes this relational dimension that you're trying to get us to think about?
Sure. I mean, pulling in disability studies on this, I think, is honestly, I think that is the most fruitful conversation partner for us to have as theologians working in posthuman discourse, because of the focus on plural embodiments and because of the really fine work that's been done around nuancing notions of agency in disability that pushes back against the idea that there's some kind of ideal norm to which we all need to kind of aspire. So this is one of those places where those two discourses, posthuman and disability, come together really interestingly. I want to make a distinction between vulnerability as a precondition for relationship and physical suffering, right? Physical suffering, I think, is a potential outcome of vulnerability, but not a necessary one. Does that make sense? So if we're in relationship, then it's possible that, I don't know, you can step on my foot or say something that hurts my feelings, right? I'm vulnerable to that. I'm invulnerable to that if we're not in relationship, and I'm never anywhere near enough for you to step on my foot. Now, which is preferable? It depends on your point of view. If I am terrified of you stepping on my foot, then maybe I will choose to never be around you and never be in relationship so that that possibility never arises. But quite possibly, the goods of being in relationship with you are worth the vulnerability to potential harm. I think we can't take that off the table because we don't control other people. And control and mastery, so again, back to a note from last night, are part of the transhumanist approach to what's going on here, particularly in terms of our relationship to the body and physical suffering, that we want to master these things so that we do not have to suffer these things. I don't know if I said enough to really answer, but.
Gentleman about just a couple of rows back. Thank you.
Stephen Gandry-Smith, Exeter. Really pleased to hear a voice that has identified the potentially therapeutic aspects of technology from a Christian perspective. And I think you're absolutely right to ask the question about just who is the we. Obviously, in the light of Ray Kurzweil, the critiques of Ray Kurzweil from a feminist perspective, that technology is all for white, wealthy, middle-class males, and being a white, relatively wealthy...
All from Silicon Valley as well,
yeah,
yes.
And being a white, middle-class male, I feel that fairly keenly. So, and I think it's really important to explore those questions. And I like your idea of the cyborg, the original cyborg, as it were. And I think you're absolutely right to say that humanity has always been interlinked and hybridized with technology. I guess my question for you that perhaps I didn't hear is, where's this going eschatologically? So what does this mean in terms of Christian transformation?
Yeah.
Obviously, you make the very important point that the relational aspect of the Imago Dei is an important prerequisite, but where's the eschatological dimension?
Yeah, I haven't done any writing particularly on where it would go eschatologically. I think sort of in terms of systematic theology, like I haven't reached that locus yet. I sort of took it through anthropology, kind of had a quick postscript with some Christological thoughts at the end of the book. And then my mind went to pneumatology from there, and I just haven't really progressed at this point to
I'd love to hear more when
yeah.
you do, actually. It's great.
I don't have any particular vision of what this might look like other than, when my daughter at a much younger age would say to me, what happens to all the dead people? My answer was, God takes care of them. I don't have anything better than that still.
Okay, thank you.
I can see four more on the line. So I think gentleman here is next, and then Maria, then gentleman here.
Thank you. So I have a question and then a brief explanation of why I have that question. So I was just wondering if you could explain what exactly you mean by vulnerability and invulnerability. Because I seem to be hearing two different kinds of vulnerability in your talk. So there's the invulnerability which the transhumanists seek, which is bodily invulnerability, right? They don't want to die. They're just scared to die. But when you talk about vulnerability, you seem to be talking about kind of the vulnerability of the soul that needs friends, that needs God. And so I think you can conceive of being able to justify certain technologies along the lines of, well, I am seeking invulnerability of the body for the purposes of maintaining relationship. So, for example, in Frankenstein, Victor's impetus for creating his monster is because his mother died, and he doesn't want anybody else to die, and he lose that relationship with them. But the irony at the heart of the story is that in seeking invulnerability of the body, he loses the relationality with everybody else, and more people die. So I'm wondering, could you just talk a bit what you mean by vulnerability and invulnerability? Do you think it's necessary to have vulnerability of the body as much as the soul? Are they interlinked, the two kinds of vulnerability?
Yes. Yeah, so you landed on exactly my instinct there. I don't think that I think that bodily vulnerability, I'm very much a materialist at heart. I want to be a kind of Donna Haraway sacramentalized materialist on this. But we are this. If this becomes invulnerable, then I don't need you. So yes, they are to me inextricably linked. The best, well, maybe not the best way, but the most fun way to kind of illustrate my instinct on this is to go back to my beloved science fiction roots and think through, what are all the really scary aliens like? They're invulnerable to us. And we depict them as, I don't know, giant bugs, right? And they want to eat us, which is the definitive narratival expression of the opposite of relationality, right? You are food. We will consume you. So what is it that makes the scary aliens the really scary aliens? It's that we are vulnerable and they are invulnerable, and we cannot reach them. We cannot discourse with them. We cannot talk them out of wanting to eat our brains. We can't do that. We can't touch them. So invulnerability precludes relationship, and it is material as much as it is social. Yeah, I think those two things are codependent.
Well, when we ask questions, could you announce your name? Where you're from, just very briefly.
Maria Sela. Okay, it's so interesting how we read things differently, because I find her Cyborg Manifesto one of the most dangerous texts of all time. Yeah. Not the enlightening ones, although I would agree with some points you made, but I just see it differently, so let's see where we disagree. Okay, so why do I find it dangerous? First of all, because I think it's scary when the weak or the others, as feminists, go in line with technological enhancement. Because if they agree to follow that line, then there is nobody else left there to defend the weak ones. And where do I get this idea? So maybe you can help me answering. So we live in this contemporary paradox where we, on one hand, agree that we should do whatever with our own nature to reinvent it as much as we can. But on the other side, if we would say to destroy these woods and build a factory, we would say this is awful, ecology is very important. So there is one attitude towards our own nature, the other attitude toward outside nature. So it would be an interesting question to try to define what is the difference between these things. Second thing is Haraway usually refers to the world without gender. So these are these postmodern identities, but why would gender be something limiting? So does she actually liberate us from the gender, or she is emphasizing that there is something in this gender which must be surpassed for me to be able to do whatever I want to? And just a third point would refer to the concrete consequences of our ideas about the future. Very concrete, very practical, very sociological, very political. And that would be what our idea, our acknowledgement of this technological enhancement, which I also think she is going for, because she's just speaking about this transitive stage. But there is some idea in the back. There is some eschatology behind it. What does it say to us about our honest understanding of people with disabilities? Because if a normal human being should and can be enhanced, do we really admit that those with disabilities are worth of living? Thank you.
So, yeah, you're right. We read Haraway very, very differently, I think. I find that her emphasis on the ambivalent possibilities of the cyborg image is, I think, at the very least, she is aware of the possibility of being pushed into the position you describe, where instead of the agency of the cyborg being liberating for specifically feminism, which is sort of her specific locus in the manifesto, that she realizes the original image of the cyborg, right, was, in her words, the man in space, completely independent of Mother Earth and invulnerable to that hostile environment. I don't need that. I'm fine. I can just go and be, right? And what she's saying there is, I think, a strong no to that vision. That's not what cyborg is, because to be cyborg for her is hybrid, not unmoored, but plugged in, if that, I don't know if I like that metaphor now that it's come out of my mouth. So I think she's better on that question than I think you're reading her as, but you're not alone in that. She has been, I think, critiqued fairly solidly on whether or not she's strong enough in resisting the sort of original 1960s command control sort of warfare image of here's the human being coupled with killer technology and we now take over. She doesn't want that. What she wants to do is say no to that by making it a feminist image and focusing on the hybridity rather than talking about it in terms of technological enhancement. I'm trying to think of even a single instance where she uses something like the term enhancement. I don't think she does. It's always about what the hybridity of the body means. And for her, that means sort of dependent relationality that is the ontological reality of the human. This is where I think someone like Carrie Wolf then connects with her out of, in a kind of disability studies and also interesting, like kind of companion species vein to say the specific embodiments that a person navigates the world with are the norm, period. There's not a single capital N norm, right, that we aspire to, and then in bioethics, that becomes the line between therapy and enhancement, and how we say yes to some things and no to others. But to say, look, this is the body you have, this is the world you navigate with it. What is it that you need? So how can you do this well? How can you accomplish what you need to accomplish? How do we give you the agency you need? Do you need a diaphragm of Gore-Tex in order to navigate the world? Okay, let's make that happen. And that's not unnatural or somehow, wrong to do so. That's life-giving for you. Now, should I go replace my diaphragm with Gore-Tex? I think probably no, because I have one that works just fine. It would not be life-giving for me to do that. So, I don't know. I feel like we just need to have coffee and and hash this out in greater detail. Haraway also is not, I think, ever willing to ascribe to a description of human nature as a thing that exists. This is probably the one thing that she and transhumanists have in common, is that they're not going to talk about nature as a sort of constraint in any kind of ontological or ethical way. Yeah.
We've got three more in the line, Moses.
Johannes Krossel, University of Siegen, Germany. I also struggle with your thesis that invulnerability makes relationship impossible. And I have two theological worries there. One was already mentioned a little bit, the eschatological worry. Aren't we in our eschatological state in a state of invulnerability, but also in an eternal loving communion with God and maybe with each other? And the Christological worry would be, is it so that God had to become vulnerable, as Christians say, become human, in order to engage in a relationship with us? Or can he form a relationship without this?
Yeah, I think those are, I can speak better to the Christological question, I think. Simply because my brain's been thinking about this for Jeff over there. So what I really kind of want to say is that we have a horror of vulnerability. Like, I understand that this makes us uncomfortable. We don't want to get hurt, but perhaps this is simply the condition of things being possible. If I had used the word responsiveness, which is more neutral, I don't think we'd have quite the discomfort with it. But it's not a strong enough word, I think, for me, because the contrast with transhumanism, I think, it's very explicit within transhumanism, I think, that invulnerability is ultimately the kind of goal in various dimensions. So, can we have a relationship with God without God being vulnerable to us? I think, not as within the sort of American hyper-Protestant context, which is my sort of immediate Christian context, there was this thing called open theism that took the world by storm back when I was doing my master's work in, 2002 or whatever, right? And the whole thing, it seemed to me, was sort of a tempest in a teapot. I was like, this doesn't bother me. Of course, if God is going to be relational and responsive to humanity, then God can't be immutable and distant and all these things. Like, there has to be the possibility of change. Vulnerability seems to me to be simply a logical extension of that same trajectory of thought. Can God not be God and be vulnerable? I think I envision a vulnerable God, and therefore maybe a vulnerable eschatology as well.
Voluntarily vulnerable or involuntarily vulnerable?
I don't know. I want to say both in different ways. I think we need to be able to choose it. I think that's what being in genuine relationship entails. I also think it's involuntary in the sense that we get thrown into life without choosing it to begin with. This is the condition of living. So both, and yeah.
Beth and then Michael.
Thank you, Jen. I'm Beth Rath from Borromeo Seminary and John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio. I'm right there with you on this anthropology of relationality. What we are relational creatures. But given your anthropology of both relationality and vulnerability, I'm wondering what posthumanism means to you. You said it's kind of relative to your anthropology. So I'm trying to get at what it means to be human versus what it means to be posthuman on your account. So it seems like what you were saying is we can use technology to become more ourselves, more vulnerable, more relational. And so then I'm wondering, is posthumanism still a category for you?
Yeah, I think I fall much more on the sort of, I keep doing that, don't I? Much more on the continuity end of the spectrum. So one of the sort of struggles between various posthuman thinkers is exactly sort of how continuous and how discontinuous these two categories are. And I think I have ended up more sympathetic with the kind of Andy Clark, Catherine Hales, this is sort of basically always what we've been and always what we've done. This is simply how we're doing it now, right? We've always been tool makers. These are our current sets of tools. These are the things we can do now. But I don't know that I'm really on board with the idea that there's some kind of radical break ahead for us ontologically between human and post-human. So, I'm. Nick Bostrom says, I think it's in the transhumanist FAQ, he pushes back against this very strongly, doesn't like the theorists that are kind of like, oh, well, we've always been post-human, or we've reconfigured our subjectivities in ways that make us post-human now. He's like, no, we're really going to have to change our bodies and brains in some fundamental way before we're post-human. So transhumanism is looking at a much more radical disjuncture than I really am, I think.
Well, big one, Michael, and then we'll finish off, have a coffee break, unless people got strong objections.
Jen, thanks so much for your wonderful comments, as always. I know, and you mentioned in passing that you kind of have this postscript on Christology. I think one of the interesting things we might, or what I'd like you to reflect upon is, and perhaps it's showing more of my sensibilities, that if we take our orientation about what it means to be human not as a cyborg in a garden, i.e. we are who we are in orientation into the first Adam, but the first Adam only ever has its sense of meaning, its center of gravity in the second Adam, would it be better than to focus more on your reflections in terms of hybridity in relation to Christ? So perhaps you'd like to unpack some of that as well. So the cyborg in the garden might not be the best place to go in terms of theological
or
typology.
maybe what we need is cyborgs in the garden and then cyborg in Gethsemane, which, to be honest, brings to mind one of my other, maybe the most useful personal takeaway out of the project for me, in that little Christological postscript, was thinking through that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane, the not my will but thine be done moment, in terms of a kind of relational posthuman subjectivity, playing around with how do we conceive of Christ as divine? What is that relationship like? How do we configure that? And to think that instead of right? If we come at this with a notion of autonomous selfhood, right, the individual self, then we have the problem of the two wills, right? I mean, we're right there in the middle of classical Christological controversy land, right? What if that's a false problem? What if, right, not my will but thine be done is not a tug of war between two things that only one of them can occupy the space, right? What if instead it's always collaboration? What if it's so relational? What if it's so sort of cyborg hybrid in that sense that it was the wrestling of how to collaborate in that moment? And of course, what comes out of it is yes. So the second Adam then manages a relational hybridity with the divine in that sense, in that particular moment, in that garden, that I have found to be a sort of personal touchstone for, well, how do I then, in all practical sense, go about living in this world in a way that truly does respect and honor and collaborate with all that I consider to be good? How do I embody that? How do I partner with that? Yeah, I don't know.
Thank you very much indeed, Jen, and for all those wonderful questions. I know the name of Nick Bostrom come up a few times. We did actually invite him to the conference, and he expressed enthusiasm. But although he deals with very advanced technologies, he has serious problems with timetables, and he's under huge pressure, he and his colleagues. So we got good wishes, but we couldn't nail him down to a day. Anyway, but thank you very much for that, and welcome, of course, to Oxford, you and your daughter Claire. I always tell people that Oxford is a garden, not a machine. And there are cyborgs in the garden. But it is, I hope that's your experience when you're here. So thank you very much for taking the time and trouble to come and join us today.